Dan Lewis here again. Now we want to look at our 10th lecture, in which I want to discuss something that probably sounds a little odd if you're not familiar with it, called the fifth gospel. This is called the Coptic Gospel of Thomas. Coptic, incidentally, is an ancient language in northern Egypt. And this gospel, the text of it comes to us in the Coptic language. To understand why this is so significant, I need to talk about a theory about the Gospels. And it's a theory that's based upon the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. There are certain sections of Matthew and Luke that are very similar to each other and in fact are nearly word for word in some places. And these sections do not appear in Mark and they do not appear in John, only in Matthew and Luke. Furthermore, these sections are largely sayings of Jesus. They're not so much narratives as they are sayings of Jesus. And so the theory was developed that perhaps Matthew and Luke had access to some kind of writing about Jesus that just listed the sayings of Jesus. And so the theory is that this became an underlying source. Matthew used it, Mark used it, not Mark, but Luke used it, and therefore they have these common sections of the sayings of Jesus. Scholars call this by the letter Q, or it's actually standing for the word cal. And Q stands for this hypothetical saying source that might underlie the canonical Gospels of Matthew and Luke. The truth is, we don't actually know that Q existed. This is a theory. We don't have any text of Q. We only have the fact that there is this agreement between Matthew and Luke. However, back in about the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, there was a discovery of 3 fragments of a text that were just similar to what we were talking about. It was just partial text, and it was discovered in what is called the Oxyrhynchus papyri. Oxyrhynchus is an area of Egypt that some scholars from England had gone to as graduate students and spent quite a number of years there excavating, and they discovered a huge compilation of ancient manuscripts mostly in Greek, some in other languages. And among these were these 3 fragments that seemed to show sayings of Jesus. So it sort of reinforced the idea that maybe there was this document called Q. The fragments they discovered weren't nearly long enough to be decisive about the existence of Q, but they certainly spurred the imagination of many scholars. Then, in 1946, another big cache of manuscripts was discovered called the Nag Hammadi text. And in these texts, there was discovered a Coptic version of a whole gospel that was attributed to Thomas. And in fact, it was discovered that the fragments that had been discovered back around 1900 were in fact fragments from this gospel. This gospel was interesting in that it has no narrative. There's no stories. There's nothing about Zacchaeus climbing the tree or anything like that. All it contains are sayings of Jesus. And the Coptic text dates to about the 4th century AD. However, the fact that it is in Coptic, which means it probably was originally in Greek and translated into Coptic, suggests that the earliest text must be earlier. Most scholars will date this text to be somewhere around 140 AD. There are actually a few scholars that try to date it as early as maybe even 50 AD, although they are very much in the minority. But nonetheless, it is a fairly early gospel, later than the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but still fairly early if it's as early as 140 AD. Here's a picture of the first page in the opening lines, which says, "These are the secret words which the living Jesus spoke, and Didymus Judas Thomas wrote. And he said, whoever finds the explanation of these words will not taste death." Now it is to the point that this gospel is a Gnostic gospel. So it belongs to that company of works, written works, that were preserved by Gnostics who tried to blend Greek philosophy with Christian theology. Scholars are quite divided about this gospel and about how important it is. It is certainly a saying source, so it doesn't have any narratives. On the other hand, it has 114 sayings, and 68 of them have parallels in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. The previous unknown sayings are very Gnostic in their theology. However, the ones that are similar to what you find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar indeed. So some scholars argue that the Gospel of Thomas is simply a gospel written after the canonical Gospels and uses the canonical Gospels as source material and then adds Gnostic material alongside it. Others suggest that maybe it was composed independently of the canonical Gospels. And a few would even put it as early as the canonical Gospels, and maybe one or two scholars that it might even be the earliest of the Gospels. In any case, in the early 1990s, the Jesus Seminar, which convened in Southern California, which was a think tank of New Testament scholars, they began to study the Gospel of Thomas along with the other Gospels, and they included it in a publication in 1993 called The Five Gospels. And that five would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Coptic Gospel of Thomas. Now let me give you some samples here. Here's a sample saying of something that we're familiar with, and this comes from the Coptic Gospel of Thomas. This is saying number 9. Jesus said, "See, the sower went out, he filled his hand, he threw. Some fell on the road, the birds came, they gathered them. Others fell on the rock and did not strike root in the earth and did not produce ears." Now, if you heard this read and you didn't know it came from the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, you might suspect it came from some translation of the English Bible of maybe the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Mark. It's very similar, at least, to the words that you find in the parable of the sower in the Synoptic Gospels. On the other hand, if you read saying number 22 in the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, this is going to sound really unusual. It says, "When you make the two one, when you make the inner as the outer, and the outer as the inner, and the above as the below, and when you make the male and female into a single one, then you shall enter the kingdom of God." And what is that supposed to mean? Well, we're not sure. That's very strange language, but it's very much like a lot of Gnostic language, which was very mystery-laden. So the Gospel of Thomas is quite controversial in this regard. I would be of the opinion that the Coptic Gospel of Thomas should not be added to the canon of the New Testament. For one reason, not only does it belong to a group that is heretical, secondly, it belongs to a group that is late. All of the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written within the living witness of people who had actually seen and heard Jesus. And those living witnesses form a validation of the canonical Gospels that could never be true of the Coptic Gospel of Thomas if this is as late as 140 AD. So at the end of this question, or at the end of this lecture, I bring up this question merely because the knowledge of the Coptic Gospel of Thomas is widening and people are talking about it, and it does appear periodically in various films on public broadcasting and things like that, documentary films, and you should at least know something about it. So this ends lecture number 10.